Switch back a little bit. Wait, well, hey, I'm live. So I was just watching uh, some content about getting started on YouTube, and one of the things was just fucking do it. Just and I guess I just screwed up if I wanted it to be monetized, didn't I? Because I used an F bomb. But hey, this is not for children. Um, so my birthday's in a couple weeks. And I was listening to one, creator coach talk about the fact that his recommendation was just get through 20 videos. You'll learn enough in the 20 videos that the quality of your videos will improve markedly, and just go ahead and do it. So that's what I'm doing. And this is video one of the 20. If you look at this channel, you'll see that I have previously done a couple of experimental things. I'm leaving everything up there for now. I think that in the course of these 20 videos, I will very likely not only make some really cringe, shitty videos, but um, develop some themes that I'm going to revisit, as my skills improve. So yeah, the first thing, look, I'm just going to make this really straightforward. So I'm going to tell my life story. This is just me attempting something. I'm about to tell my life story, and I'm going to make it, just the sort of the highlights, really a geographical history, mostly with a couple of important details in there. And I want you to see if anybody who watches this, if I surprise you at any point. My voice is still hoarse. I've not been able to speak for a while. It's just coming back, so bear with me. But there's a clue in that, right? Listen closely, and if at any point something about my delivery changes in a way that you find unexpected, let me know. Leave a comment, leave a like, leave a share, subscribe, whatever. Again, this is really just practice. Okay, so I was actually born in Minnesota. I was not born in the Twin Cities, where so much is going down right now. I was, in fact, born in Duluth, but my older brother, my father, and my grandfather were all born in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the twin to Minneapolis, of course. I was born in Duluth, but I never really lived in Minnesota. Well, my family on my father's side stayed in Minnesota, which means that I would visit, summer vacations, Christmas breaks, things like that. Family reunion when I was a child, very big. The Irish side of my family, all there in Minnesota, but I was very, very young. So I would visit Minnesota a lot. I knew that my father and that whole side of the family was really based in Minnesota, but I didn't grow up there. I was born in Duluth very quick. I have no memories of it. By the time I was 3 years old, I was living in Oregon. I turned 4 in New York, 5 in Wisconsin, 6 in Wyoming. And by the time I turned 10 years old, I was living in Pennsylvania. That's a half a dozen states, from coast to coast, sea to shining sea, amber waves of grain, and Rocky Mountains majesty. Really, the commonality in all of those places essentially was that I lived in very overwhelmingly white, blue collar small towns. Right, you could almost say rural, because in most cases I wasn't even anywhere near a city. Briefly in New York, I lived on Long Island. I was, as I think I said, I think it was 4 years old there. But and this is not because I was a military brat. My father actually in Duluth had been in graduate school, and so shortly after I was born, my family sort of took off as my father's career would take him from one place to another, culminating, as I said, in Pennsylvania by the time I was 10. There, things started to go a little bit south because my father became extremely ill with a neurological disease, very, very rare neurological illness, extremely debilitating in his case, that left him medically disabled. Now, if you can't tell from this old mug, we're talking about way, way, way pre-Obamacare days. We're talking about the earliest 1990s. George H.W. Bush was in office. This was before Hillary Clinton even tried to rectify the nightmare of the U.S. healthcare system. And so, as you might imagine, back in those days, when a 30-something man with 3 dependent children at home is really getting to the sort of heart of his career, working years, and all of a sudden he's cut low by this disease. Well, what happened is he was medically disabled, which is to say that he was essentially forced into retirement. He was an employee of the state, as a matter of fact, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as a professor at one of the University of Pennsylvania branch campuses. or Pennsylvania State University branch campuses. I'm sorry, I think I might have mistaken that. But he was nevertheless forced into retirement and lost his medical coverage as soon as he was retired. He was too young for Medicaid or too young for Medicare, ineligible for Medicaid, I think also for age reasons. And there was no COBRA at that point or anything like that. He had a pre-existing condition. And it was a condition that the medical community had no idea how to treat. So what they did was they gave him more and more extremely expensive and extremely toxic drugs, and essentially we were being bankrupted. And the long and short of it is this: that my parents, when I was 17 years old, took the very sort of dramatic decision to um, flee the country, right? Because there was a country in Central America that they had identified where they would have the right to retire as pensioners with the very meager disability income that my father was getting, and access that country's universal healthcare coverage. And so that was the decision that was made. But what that meant was that we moved out of the country. We fled the United States when I was 17 years old. And as the dependent child of legal retirees in the country, I was entirely legal. Todo eso cambió cuando yo cumplí 18 años, porque ya en ese momento ya no era legal, porque ya no era menor de edad. Y eso quiere decir que ya no era pendiente de mis padres, que yo tenía que tener un estatus legal a mi nombre propio, y no lo tenía. Entonces, bueno, me quedaban, yo creo que unos 90 días después de mi cumpleaños, ya como turista, entre comillas. Y luego he estado viviendo yo en el país como inmigrante no documentado. Eso quiere decir que me gradué del colegio, salí del colegio y empecé a trabajar al negro, como mojado. Yo, el gringo más gringo. Y que no, y que bueno, o sea, que lo sepan, yo no hablaba ni una palabra de español antes de llegar a ese país, antes de huir de Estados Unidos. Yo empecé a aprender el español de inmediato porque eso es lo que pasa con un inmigrante. Uno no tiene, uno, o sea, que no le queda otro, que no le queda opción. Uno tiene que trabajar. Y es más, yo empecé, saliendo del colegio, yo empecé a trabajar como guía turística bilingüe. Y eso quiere decir que yo tenía que, como yo tenía grupos mixtos, muchas veces yo tenía que cambiar cada par de oraciones, explicando esta parte en inglés y repitiéndolo todo en español y siguiendo y cambiando para que todo el mundo entendiera todo y no perdíamos tiempo y bueno, o sea, como el flow del grupo y etcétera. Y al fin muchas veces al final del tour, los turistas llegaban y me preguntaban que cómo había yo aprendido el inglés y que mi inglés era tan bueno. Y yo explicaba que, bueno, o sea, de hecho, yo, yo aprendí el inglés como ellos en Estados Unidos, que yo solo inglés hablaba hasta muy recientemente cuando había llegado ahí. Y como unos 6 semanas después, llegó mi jefe y me dice, tenemos un problema que varios turistas me han quejado. O sea, tienen que ellos de ti. Yo, ¿qué? Pues resulta que nadie quería creer que yo había llegado a ese nivel de español, de fluidez, de bilingüismo, con solo unos 18 meses de experiencia, de estudio, etcétera. Entonces decidieron que yo tenía que estar vendiendo y a pesar de que el dueño, que conocía muy bien mi historia y por eso me explotaba muy bien, eh, como mojado que yo era, am, me ordenó a mentir. Me dijo, bueno, de ahora en adelante, cuando alguien te pregunta de dónde vienes, le vas a decir que tu mamá es latina o que te criaste aquí y que, bueno, o sea, me ordenó a cambiar mi historia y dejar de contar la verdad y sustituirla con una versión más creíble para los gringos. O sea que ya con 18 añitos, los gringos, los turistas, me estaban como disminuyendo mi americanismo, mi gringuismo, entre comillas. But Anyway, I eventually made enough money to return to the U.S. and this time I was staying away from red state America. I was staying away from the small towns, the sort of Rust Belt blue collar towns that I had grown up in, and I went to an elite university. I was very lucky to be admitted to my dream school. It was an elite university in California, Southern California. There were a lot of Latinos there, so I was able to continue using Spanish. It wasn't as big of a deal, although it continued to be a surprise when people would hear me speak this y de repente cambio y estoy hablando español y que no tengo un acento. Yo no sé cómo los hispanoparlantes que están escuchando esto van a encontrar mi español, pero para mucha gente no le parezca al menos muy gringo. Entonces, pero bueno, o sea, estamos hablando de Los Ángeles de los años 90, etcétera, y era como que un party trick, right? But so, I stayed there, I was studying, etc. and and I continued to live in very like blue state, the heart of the elite West Coast. I had really crossed that red blue divide. I had grown up very, very, very much. We're talking about small towns in places like Wyoming, Northwest Pennsylvania, the heart of what is Trump country, if you will, nowadays. But by the time I returned to the U.S. As a young man to study in California, I was, I was in Hollywood. I was in the bluest part of the bluest city of the bluest state, and I was completely, almost entirely cut off from that sort of heartland America. But I still know it well. I mean, that's where both of my both sides of my family. That's really where they're from. Although, admittedly, my father also has deep connections to Minnesota Democratic politics. That side of my family has been very connected, and as a matter of fact, my first cousin, twice removed, was a major party presidential candidate in the second half of the 20th century. But in my mother's side, very much like Central Illinois Corn Belt, indistinguishable from Iowa, a million miles from Chicago in terms of culture and mentality and whatnot. But then I spent the adult part of my return to the U.S. in the exact contrary, in the bluest of the blue part of the country. And there I also briefly, shortly after I arrived, I had a Swiss boyfriend. And so, we had a relationship. I had other relationships over those years and whatnot. And he eventually returned to Europe. He went on to study in Paris. And I lost track of him after that, until the rise of social media. And in the very early years of Facebook, I happened across, a photo of him, and I thought of him, and I wondered how he was doing, and I wondered how many of him there might be on Facebook. And I looked him up, and sure enough, there was only one. And I sent him a message, and before you knew it, one thing led to another, and I had gone to visit him, and we wanted to get married. And at that time, we could not get married because even if it had been legal in California, it was briefly, and then it was overturned. Some of you might know. But what happened was that he was, because he was a foreign national, the federal government would have been responsible for issuing him a visa for family reunification purposes, or as a binational couple, which meant that it didn't matter whether we lived in California or a state that recognized gay marriage or not. There was no way for us to be together except for me to come to Europe. And so, donc, c'est ça ce que j'ai fait. Et puis, je me suis déménagé direct de Los Angeles à un petit bled perdu dans les montagnes du Jura, où j'avais pas le choix. Le canton du Jura, le canton du Jura suisse, c'est français. T'as pas le choix. Même si la plupart des Suisses parlent plutôt allemand, ça sert à rien dans le Jura. Donc, j'avais pas le choix. Alors, si je voulais être avec mon mari, je devais me déménager vers l'Europe. Et je me suis trouvé dans ce petit village où j'étais obligé d'apprendre le français. Alors, ça veut dire que I now spoke 3 languages. Et puis, je parle le français comme vous l'écoutez. J'ai moins d'expérience J'ai jamais fait comme ce que j'avais fait auparavant en espagnol, dans le tourisme. Donc, c'est un peu bizarre, franchement, pour moi, euh, parler français comme ça, mais voilà, c'était comme ça. Donc, après, euh, j'ai trouvé un boulot, un travail je devais traverser la Röstigraben. C'est la frontière linguistique dans la Suisse entre la partie francophone, la Romandie, et la partie germanophone. Donc, j'ai trouvé un boulot dans la partie germanophone et j'ai fait le, le trajectoire, je pendulais quotidiennement. Et puis, éventuellement, on a déménagé vers la partie germanophone. Et puis, ja, also dann musste ich natürlich auch Deutsch lernen. Also das war nicht so fürs Arbeit, sondern eher also weil ich wollte. Einfach so. Ähm, ich habe immer, also ich lerne sehr gern Sprachen. Ich interessiere mich viel für die Sprachen. Und jetzt bemerke ich, dass es ist mir noch schwieriger, also einfach so Deutsch zu reden als Französisch. Aber das ist auch natürlich so, glaube ich, weil die sind die letzte auf vier Sprachen, die ich gelernt haben musste. So, what's funny about this is that along the way, as this continued, um, there was a moment where I was working on a French language film in Switzerland, and I was working with actually a fairly well known comedic actor from France, a gentleman named Guy Leclise, a lovely gentleman, and we were speaking French, and he said to me, "Mais si vous êtes américain, non, on se tutoyait. Si tu es américain, pourquoi tu parles avec un accent espagnol?" He wanted to know why I speak with a Spanish accent, why I speak French with a Spanish accent. And so I told him, well, I learned Spanish first. And he said, wait a minute, you're an American who speaks French and Spanish and English. And I said, well, yeah. And he said, he goes, "Et t'es un licorne aussi?" He asked me if I was a unicorn. But my point here is this is all just my long-winded way of talking about some of my experiences. And the real kicker, the clincher, came shortly after I had gotten work in the German part of the country, and actually has nothing to do with the German that I would eventually learn. But I was working for a major international corporation uh, in the agricultural sector, and I was working at the global headquarters when we invited associates from all over the world to a large event at the headquarters where I was kind of helping acclimate people and I was doing a lot of publicity for it and things like internal publicity for it and things like that. And there was a gentleman who was from rural Iowa, really not far from where my mother had grown up and where I had always gone to see that side of my family. My grandparents had lived in the corn belt of Illinois my whole life. He sounded very much, the way he spoke was sounded very much like my grandfather. And he was very happy to chat with me, and we would talk about, I knew some things about the area. I knew some things about, the local culture in that very heartland honky kind of way. And we were chatting one morning at breakfast until an Argentinian gentleman that I had been speaking to the night before saw us and kind of waved over. He was like, "Hey, buenos días, me puedo reunir con ustedes y me siento con ustedes, no sé qué." And I was like, "Yeah, sure, please, welcome." Now, because the lingua franca of the company was English, that gentleman obviously could speak English, but we had kicked off in a sort of more social moment at an event the night prior in Spanish, and that was the language that he spoke to me when he approached, causing the farmer from Iowa with his very Chuck Grassley tones to get suspicious and to start to look at me sideways, and but he didn't say anything at first. And I tried to make the conversation a little bit more comfortable. I tried to turn it a little, to keep it in English, make it feel more participatory. Although the Argentinian was more inclined to speak directly to me, at least in Spanish, which didn't bother me. It was just a matter of politeness, I suppose. And then, after maybe 15 or 20 minutes, a Belgian gentleman who I had also met at a previous event saw me and was like, "Hey, salut, bonjour, bah, est-ce que vous avez déjà mangé? Je peux m'asseoir avec vous?" And I was like, "Sure, come on, sit down." And when the farmer realized that now I had not only spoken Spanish, but I was speaking French to another colleague, he stood up and he just looked really disgusted. And he stood up and he goes, "That's just un American." And he walked away. And he did not speak to me again for the rest of the of his time at the global headquarters in Switzerland. And so, from the time I was working as a wetback tour guide in Central America um, to my late 30s, there were a couple of occasions in my life where I left the US to enjoy greater freedom elsewhere. The freedom to see my father access much needed healthcare, the freedom to marry the partner of my choice. Those are the reasons that I left the United States. And while the second instance was less, it was less dramatic, and I always did have legal status after moving to Europe. Um, I learned languages with excitement and pleasure and joy, as well as necessity, because I just found it incredible to speak to people on their own terms, which is a thing that native English speakers very rarely get to do. And I cannot overstate the value of. People behave differently, they speak differently, they're more open, they trust you more um, if they can speak to you in their own language. And so if you're an Anglophone that thinks that you know a lot about the world because you have Asian friends and European friends and African friends and Latino friends and friends from all over the world, but they're all speaking to you in English, I dare say you're nowhere near as international as you think you are. And if you haven't walked a mile in their moccasins, and if you haven't gone through the experience of struggling to speak that second language when you're still in the early learning period and feeling foolish and sometimes being laughed at or mocked and feeling that self-consciousness and learning to be fearless because you have to, um, that is an experience that binds you to other people that have done similarly. And so, little did I know that not only was I odd for having the opportunity to learn other languages and taking it, but it turns out that to a lot of Americans, the fact that I did it was like a type of treason. And I think that it's not a coincidence that the kind of Americans that felt that way are the kind of Americans that I have been trying to get the fuck away from since I was 16 years old. In small towns, overwhelmingly white, blue collar, Rust Belt, red America, red state, blue collar, white trash. That's the red, white, and blue America that I never wanted to be. And it was America itself that pushed me out. And it was Americans themselves that decided that based on what I did with those overseas experiences, I will become, in the words of that elderly Iowa farmer, finally just downright un-American. Well, that's what made me decide to wear that mantle proudly. And this video sucked. But as I get better, I will be back here tomorrow and I will explain a little bit about why it matters. Because it does matter. It really matters now more than ever. And that's the real point of this channel. What we've seen, particularly in the last year, in the last month, or since the beginning of 2026, is, in the words of Canadian PM Mark Carney, a rupture, not a transition. The American century is over. And for the first time in anyone's living memory, the world is not looking to America as a model or a guidance or a guide or a lifeline. Not that they were by any means for most of the American century, but there was enough of it going on for the American people to delude themselves into thinking, oh, we're the freest country in the world. We're the greatest country in the world, which ironically is one of the few things that you could get everyone from RuPaul to Sean Hannity to agree to. It crossed every ideological line. Greatest country on earth. That has always been bullshit. And I find it interesting that I'm not hearing it so much the last few weeks. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've heard it in 2026. And I think that's because the Americans know it too. Based on what's happening inside your country and based on the fact that that clown is bumbling around the world stage and the whole world can see it. America has crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back. The world is figuring out ways to bypass America, despite the fact that it remains militarily, economically, culturally, the most powerful nation in the history of humanity. But we're watching that change in real time. We're watching that power erode by the day. And I'm going to be your guide to what comes next. All right. So, wow. That was a long live ramble that nobody watched, fortunately, but it will be sitting here on this channel. And I'll be back tomorrow to give it another shot.